Thessaly discovered that her entire doctoral thesis had been stolen. When she saw Bramwell Ashcroft presenting her research at an academic conference in Edinburgh, standing at the podium with his characteristic smugness while explaining theories about manuscript preservation that she had spent 7 years developing in the dusty archives of 3 different countries. He wasn't just borrowing concepts or building on her work. He was reading verbatim from chapters she'd shared with him during their brief collaboration 2 years ago. Back when he'd convinced her that joining forces would benefit them both. Before he'd ghosted her and apparently decided her life's work would make an excellent foundation for his own career. She sat in the back row of that conference hall, feeling her hands go numb, watching colleagues nod appreciatively at Bramwell's brilliance, and something cold and calculated began forming in her mind. Something that had nothing to do with the hot rage burning in her chest and everything to do with the fact that Bramwell had made one critical mistake. He didn't actually understand the research he'd stolen. Thessaly didn't confront him after the presentation, didn't send angry emails or threaten legal action, didn't even let her face betray the recognition when he walked past her in the hotel lobby that evening. Instead, she went back to her room and opened her laptop, pulling up every draft, every note, every piece of correspondence she'd ever had with Bramwell, and she began to plan something that would take months to execute but would be absolutely devastating in its precision. She knew that Bramwell was ambitious in the worst way, the kind of academic who cared more about prestige than truth, who networked obsessively and name-dropped at every opportunity, and who was already positioning himself for a department head role at Cambridge based largely on his groundbreaking research. The first seed was planted 3 weeks later when Thessaly created a pseudonymous academic blog under the name Dr. Cordelia Winters, ostensibly run by a retired manuscript expert who enjoyed commenting on contemporary research in the field. She made sure the blog looked legitimate, filling it with thoughtful posts about various topics, building credibility slowly, never mentioning Bramwell at all for the first 2 months. She engaged with other scholars, left insightful comments on academic forums, and gradually Dr. Cordelia Winters became a respected, if mysterious voice in their small academic community, someone whose opinions carried weight precisely because they seemed to come from a place of pure intellectual interest rather than career ambition. Thessaly knew that Bramwell's stolen research had a fatal flaw, one that she'd deliberately left in the drafts she'd shared with him, because she'd still been working through a particular theoretical problem about 14th century scribal practices. She had eventually solved the problem in later drafts that Bramwell had never seen. But his version, the one he presented in Edinburgh, contained an argument that seemed sophisticated but would crumble under sustained expert scrutiny. It was the academic equivalent of a house built on sand, impressive from the outside but structurally unsound. And Thessaly was going to make sure everyone in their field knew it. Through Dr. Cordelia Winters, Thessaly began posting thoughtful questions about medieval manuscript authentication. Nothing aggressive or accusatory, just intelligent queries that other scholars found engaging. She built relationships with some of the most respected names in the field, people whose endorsement could make or break a career, and she waited. She watched as Bramwell published 2 more papers based on her stolen research. Watched him give interviews to academic podcasts. Watched him get invited to speak at Oxford and the Sorbonne. And she documented everything with the patience of someone who understood that the best revenge is served cold enough to give frostbite. 4 months after Edinburgh, Dr. Cordelia Winters published a detailed blog post analyzing recent trends in manuscript preservation theory, praising some approaches while gently questioning others. Buried in the middle of this post was a seemingly casual observation about certain methodological assumptions that, while popular, might not hold up when examined against newly digitized archives from Bruges. The post was scholarly, measured, and didn't mention Bramwell by name, but anyone who'd read his work would recognize the description. And several prominent academics shared the post with comments like food for thought and raises interesting questions. Thessaly watched Bramwell's Twitter feed that day, saw him tweet something dismissive about armchair critics before apparently thinking better of it and deleting the post. She smiled because she knew that had gotten under his skin, knew that he was probably wondering who this Dr. Cordelia Winters was and whether he should be worried. But the beauty of her plan was that one blog post wasn't enough to damage him. It was just enough to plant doubt, to make a few people wonder. And Bramwell was too arrogant to see it as the beginning of something larger. The second seed came in the form of a question that Dr. Cordelia Winters posed in an academic forum that Bramwell frequented, asking for recommendations about resources for understanding scribal practice in Flemish monasteries during the 1340s. Several scholars chimed in with suggestions, and Bramwell, unable to resist showing off, provided what he clearly thought was an authoritative answer, citing his research and explaining the theory with the confidence of someone who'd written the book on the subject. Thessaly read his response 3 times, noting every place where he'd misunderstood the nuances, every point where his explanation revealed that he'd memorized her conclusions without understanding the methodology that had led to them. Dr. Cordelia Winters thanked Bramwell politely and then, over the next week, asked a series of follow-up questions that seemed innocuous, but were actually designed to expose the gaps in his understanding. She asked about specific manuscripts, about technical details that would be obvious to someone who'd actually done the archival work, about methodological choices that someone who developed the theory would be able to explain. Bramwell's answers became increasingly vague and defensive, falling back on jargon and appeals to authority, and other scholars in the forum began to notice. Thessaly knew she needed to be patient because rushing would make her look vindictive, but she also knew that academic reputations were fragile things built on perception and peer respect. She spent her evenings going through every piece of her original research, creating an ironclad paper trail that proved not just that the work was hers, but when she developed each idea, where she'd done her archival research, which experts she'd consulted. She backed everything up multiple times, stored copies with her lawyer, and prepared for the endgame with the thoroughness of someone who knew she'd only get one shot at this. The third seed was the most delicate because it involved reaching out to Professor Helena Dragomir, the formidable scholar who'd been Thessaly's doctoral advisor and who still commanded enormous respect in the field. Thessaly had stayed in touch with Helena over the years, sending occasional updates about her research, and now she arranged to meet her former advisor for coffee in London, where Helena was visiting for a lecture series. They talked about various projects, about departmental politics, about the state of manuscript studies, and then, carefully, Thessaly mentioned that she'd been developing some new thoughts about scribal practices and would value Helena's feedback on some arguments she'd been working through. She didn't mention Bramwell, didn't say anything about theft, just shared some of her original research, the advanced version that Bramwell had never seen, the work that solved the theoretical problems his stolen version still contained. Helena listened with the intense focus she brought to everything, asked sharp questions, and then sat back with a look that Thessaly recognized from her doctoral defenses. "This is exceptional work," Thessaly, Helena said, and then, more quietly, "I saw Bramwell Ashcroft present something that sounded superficially similar to this at Edinburgh, but his version seemed to be missing something crucial." Thessaly met her former advisor's eyes and said simply, "I'm planning to publish this next month, and I thought you should see it first." Helena was nobody's fool and had been in academia long enough to recognize intellectual theft when she saw it, especially when presented with evidence this clear. She didn't say anything explicit, but her expression shifted into something cold and sharp, the look she reserved for plagiarists and frauds. "I'll be very interested to read your publication," she said, and Thessaly knew that she'd just gained a powerful ally without having to ask for one, the fourth seed involved. Thessaly actually finishing and publishing her complete research. Not in some obscure journal that Bramwell could ignore, but in one of the most prestigious publications in their field. A journal where Helena Dragomir sat on the editorial board and could expedite the review process for truly groundbreaking work. Thessaly's paper was meticulous, comprehensive, and devastating because it didn't just present her theories, but showed every step of her archival work. Every manuscript she'd examined, every logical progression from evidence to conclusion. Anyone reading it would understand not just what she discovered, but how she discovered it. The kind of deep methodological transparency that only comes from someone who'd actually done the work. She included dates on everything, references to archives she'd visited in 2019 and 2020, correspondence with other scholars from years ago, a paper trail that made it absolutely clear when this research had been developed. She didn't mention Bramwell anywhere in the paper because she didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. And she knew that the moment this was published, every scholar who'd read Bramwell's work would recognize it as a hollow imitation of something far more sophisticated. The paper was scheduled to publish in mid-October, and Thessaly marked the date on her calendar with a satisfaction that felt like vindication. Meanwhile, Dr. Cordelia Winters continued her patient work, building credibility and asking thoughtful questions that kept circling back to methodological rigor and the importance of original archival research. She wrote a blog post about the ethics of collaboration in academia, about how sharing work with colleagues required trust and how betraying that trust undermined the entire scholarly enterprise. She didn't name names, but she painted a picture that anyone familiar with academic politics would recognize, and the post was shared widely, sparking discussions about intellectual property and proper attribution. Bramwell, for his part, seemed oblivious to the trap closing around him because his ego wouldn't let him see it. He had been invited to give a keynote speech at a major conference in November, one that would cement his status as a rising star in the field. And Thessaly knew he was already drafting his remarks, probably planning to expand even further on his theories about manuscript preservation. She imagined him practicing in front of a mirror, perfecting his delivery, completely unaware that his entire career was about to implode. The fifth seed was planted when Thessaly created a detailed timeline document that she shared privately with 3 trusted colleagues, scholars she'd known for years who had unimpeachable reputations for integrity. The document laid out everything: when she developed her research, when she collaborated with Bramwell, what materials she'd shared with him, and how his subsequent publications had used her work without attribution. She included screenshots of emails, drafts with timestamps, even a photograph of her original handwritten notes from the archives in Bruges dated 2 years before Bramwell's first publication on the subject. She asked these colleagues to simply review the document and form their own conclusions, making it clear that she wasn't asking them to do anything public yet, but wanted them to be aware of the situation before her paper published. All 3 responded with varying degrees of outrage, with one senior professor writing back that he'd had his own suspicions about Bramwell's work because it had always seemed too polished for someone without extensive archival experience. They promised to read her forthcoming paper carefully, and Thessaly knew that once they did, the whisper network that governed academic reputations would begin turning against Bramwell, October arrived and Thessaly's paper published to immediate acclaim, with scholars across the field recognizing it as a major contribution that fundamentally changed how they understood medieval scribal practices. Helena Dragomir wrote a glowing response piece calling it the most significant work in manuscript studies in a decade. And suddenly, Thessaly's inbox was flooded with congratulations, interview requests, and invitations to present at conferences. But more importantly, within 24 hours of publication, she started seeing the comparisons to Bramwell's earlier work, the questions about similarities, the increasingly pointed observations, that his version seemed like a preliminary sketch of her more comprehensive analysis. Dr. Cordelia Winters published a blog post 2 days later titled On Originality and Archival Rigor, which analyzed both Thessaly's new paper and Bramwell's earlier publications side by side. The post was devastating in its precision, pointing out not just the similarities, but the crucial differences, noting how Bramwell's work contained the exact theoretical problems that Thessaly had identified and solved, asking pointed questions about how someone could present conclusions without showing the archival work that supposedly led to them. The post went viral within their academic community, shared and discussed and dissected until Bramwell's name became associated with doubt rather than brilliance. Thessaly watched as Bramwell tried to defend himself on Twitter, posting threads about how great minds often think alike and how academic discourse involves building on others' work. But every defense made it worse because he couldn't explain how he'd come to identical conclusions without doing identical archival research, couldn't produce the documentation that Thessaly had in abundance, couldn't account for why his version contained errors that hers had corrected. Other scholars began examining his work more critically, finding other instances of questionable attribution, other papers where his sources seemed suspiciously thin, and the narrative shifted from whether he plagiarized Thessaly to how much of his career was built on stolen work. The conference where Bramwell was supposed to give his keynote in November quietly rescinded their invitation, releasing a diplomatic statement about scheduling conflicts that everyone understood meant they wanted nothing to do with the controversy. Cambridge put his department head appointment on hold pending review, and Thessaly heard through the academic grapevine that several of his graduate students were frantically trying to distance themselves from association with him. The Twitter account that had once broadcast his achievements went silent, and when Thessaly checked his university profile page, his photo had been replaced with a generic silhouette. But Thessaly wasn't done, because the point wasn't just to expose Bramwell, but to make sure that everyone understood exactly what he'd done and why it mattered. She agreed to give an interview to a prominent academic podcast where she told her story carefully and factually, explaining how she'd trusted a colleague with her work and how that trust had been betrayed. She didn't rant or rage, didn't call him names or make wild accusations, just laid out the facts with the same methodical precision she brought to her research. The podcast episode was titled The Theft of Ideas, a case study in academic ethics, and it was downloaded over 50,000 times in the first week. Dr. Cordelia Winters published one final blog post, revealing her true identity as Thessaly and explaining why she created the pseudonym in the first place. She wrote about how women in academia were often told to be quiet about injustice, to not make waves, to handle things privately through official channels that rarely worked. She explained that she'd created Dr. Cordelia Winters because she knew that her accusations would be taken more seriously if they seemed to come from a disinterested third party, because she'd learned that women who spoke up about being wronged were often dismissed as emotional or vindictive. The post was raw and honest and struck a chord with hundreds of other academics who'd experienced similar theft but had felt powerless to fight. The professional consequences for Bramwell came swiftly after that because institutions hate scandal, and academic communities have long memories. His publications were formally reviewed by journal editors who found sufficient evidence of plagiarism to warrant retractions, not just of work stolen from Thessaly, but from several other scholars who came forward once they saw what had happened. His teaching position at his university became non-renewed, academic code for being fired without the drama of a formal termination, and his application for a research grant that he'd been counting on was quietly denied. The Oxford lecture series that was supposed to happen in January was cancelled, and when he tried to publish a response defending himself, no reputable journal would touch it. Thessaly received offers from 3 different universities wanting to recruit her for tenure-track positions, including one from Cambridge, to fill the very role that Bramwell had been positioning himself for. Helena Dragomir wrote a recommendation letter calling Thessaly one of the finest scholarly minds of her generation, and specifically praising her integrity and commitment to original research. The book deal that Thessaly had been cautiously negotiating for her expanded research suddenly became much more attractive, with publishers competing to acquire what was now recognized as landmark work in the field. 6 months after the Edinburgh conference where this had all begun, Thessaly sat in her new office at Cambridge, looking out over the medieval courtyards, and thought about revenge. She'd never wanted to destroy Bramwell, had never set out to ruin someone's career. But he'd chosen to steal years of her life, and she'd simply made sure the truth came out in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The long game had required patience and precision, had demanded that she channel her rage into something calculated and devastating. But watching Bramwell's career crumble under the weight of his own dishonesty had been worth every careful step. The final piece of irony came when Thessaly received an email from a graduate student at another university asking if she'd be willing to serve on a dissertation committee examining medieval manuscript preservation techniques. Student explained that she'd been inspired by Thessaly's recent work and wanted to develop some of the theoretical frameworks further, asking for permission to build on the research with proper attribution. Thessaly smiled as she typed her response, agreeing enthusiastically and offering to share her archival notes and methodology, because that was how scholarship was supposed to work, building on each other's ideas openly and honestly, giving credit where it was due, advancing knowledge together rather than stealing it in the dark, shared occasionally about Bramwell through the academic grapevine, about how he'd left England entirely and was supposedly teaching at some tiny university in Eastern Europe where nobody knew his history. Someone told her he'd started using a slightly different version of his name, trying to rebuild from scratch, and Thessaly felt something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't satisfaction either. He'd had real talent once before he'd decided that stealing was easier than doing the work. And now he'd spend the rest of his career in obscurity, knowing that he'd destroyed his own future. Dr. Cordelia Winter's blog remained online, maintained by Thessaly as a resource for other academics dealing with intellectual theft. She posted occasionally about ethics and scholarship, about protecting your work while still collaborating generously, about the importance of paper trails and documentation. The blog had become something of a resource for young scholars who found themselves in situations where their work was being exploited, and Thessaly took pride in helping others avoid the betrayal she'd experienced. The revenge Thessaly had taken wasn't loud or violent, wasn't the kind of dramatic confrontation that made for good television. It was methodical and thorough, executed with the same scholarly precision she brought to examining medieval manuscripts, and it had resulted in the complete dismantling of a career built on lies. Bramwell had stolen her work, thinking he could get away with it, thinking she'd be too intimidated or too powerless to fight back. And instead, she'd destroyed him using nothing but the truth, carefully presented and impossible to refute. Every time Thessaly published new research, every time she was invited to speak at a prestigious conference, every time a student cited her work in their own scholarship, it was a reminder that merit and integrity ultimately triumph over theft and deception. She kept the email from the client who'd accidentally CC'd her on that first discovery, the one that had revealed Bramwell's betrayal, in a folder labeled Beginnings. Sometimes she'd read it when she needed to remember why she'd spent months planning instead of simply exploding in rage. Why she'd created Dr. Cordelia Winters and planted seeds and waited for them to grow into something devastating. The email reminded her that she'd been right to channel her anger into something productive, to turn betrayal into an opportunity to expose not just one plagiarist, but to shine a light on a problem that plagued academia more broadly. And late at night, when Thessaly was working on her next research project in the archives, she'd sometimes think about Bramwell, reading her publications and knowing that everything he'd stolen had become the foundation of her success while simultaneously destroying him. That was the real revenge. Not that she'd caught him, but that she'd taken back everything he'd taken from her and turned it into something so brilliant that his theft became obvious by comparison. He wanted to stand on her shoulders and claim the view as his own, but instead she'd stepped out from under him and watched him fall. And there was a cold satisfaction in knowing that every word of her scholarship would forever be a reminder of his failure. The story spread through academic circles as a cautionary tale about the dangers of plagiarism in the digital age, about how easy it is to steal someone's work and how impossible it is to hide that theft when the original researcher decides to fight back with evidence and patience. Thessaly became something of a reluctant icon for junior scholars who'd been exploited, and she accepted that role with the same grace she brought to everything else, understanding that her revenge had been personal, but its implications were universal. Years later, when Thessaly's book was published to universal acclaim and won several prestigious awards, she included a dedication that simply read, "For everyone whose work has been stolen and who wondered if truth would ever prevail." She didn't mention Bramwell by name because she didn't need to. Everyone in their field knew exactly what she was referring to, and that nameless acknowledgement was somehow more devastating than any explicit call-out could have been. He'd become a footnote in her success story, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when ambition outpaces integrity. The revenge was complete, total, and utterly destroying, not because Thessaly had been cruel, but because she'd been methodical, patient, and absolutely right. And in academia, there is no greater condemnation than being proven wrong while someone else is proven brilliant.